Welcome back to Offworld, the show where we talk about all things space exploration and pop culture. I'm Ariel Waldman.
And I'm Norm Chan. We've got a classic science fiction film for you this week. It's Spielberg's maybe second best well-known alien film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yeah, it's, I don't know, it's delightful. It's a delightful film in so much as it's very much 1977, and it's a long film. It's got a lot of arty elements. It's weird, but it's a classic. It became a classic, sort of unbeknownst to the Spielberg, I think, at the time. And I'm really excited to have our guest today dive into it and talk about ufology, UFO culture, language. How do we even communicate with aliens? I don't know. It was really fun to dive into this movie finally.
Well, let's take a listen.
Okay, so we're talking about Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I actually hadn't watched this movie for a while, and I'm really excited to have both of you on the show today. Rose, could you introduce yourself? Say a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rose. I'm the host of Flash Forward, which is a podcast about the future, possible and maybe less possible future scenarios. This movie's probably more on the latter side, the way it plays out. But I also write a column for Wired and sort of write other places, but mostly cover the future.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to have you on the show. And Laura, tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are.
Yeah. Well, my background is in linguistics, so I was kind of trained as an academic linguist. But I am now in the world of nonprofits, and I work for the Long Now Foundation. I'm the director of operations there, and I work on our language programs and our library programs. And I'm also on the board of directors of MEDI International.
Yes, which I'm on the advisory board of, I believe. Yeah, Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show today. So, as I mentioned, we all watched Close Encounters. I think for all of us, maybe it had been a while since we watched it or watched it the whole way through. Film from 1977. Definitely of its time, I would say. Definitely very 70s in more ways than one. How do you think, our views of aliens and extraterrestrial intelligence and just extraterrestrials in general has changed since 1977, or has it? This is like a pinnacle film of, aliens being, little green men and I don't know, lots of different concepts to sort of dive into with it. So do you think our concept sort of in the mainstream of aliens from 1977 to today has changed much, or has it not?
There's a whole thing with Area 51 right now, right?
There is.
So, I think in that respect, maybe not so much. There's still kind of this idea in our culture of, I think, the same kind of aliens, the gray aliens, alien abductions, kind of the government doing secret things in communication with aliens. I think that's very prominent. But also, I think, with the discovery of exoplanets and more, I think, awareness about SETI, and also MEDI activities, the idea that we could potentially communicate or establish some kind of contact seems a little bit more kind of realistic, but within the realm of sort of scientific reality rather than just kind of fiction.
Yeah, what do you think, Rose?
Yeah, right, in the last year or so, there have been more than one, I think, New York Times articles about government reports about UFOs, right, which is central in many ways to this movie. I think that, you see a little bit more of a hopeful idea of what aliens might be, perhaps, in this, in that, they're ultimately friendly and they ultimately just, want to teach us some notes or, communicate with us, right, and tell us something. Whereas, I think there is now a little bit more anxiety, and there are, prominent thinkers who have said, even if you believe there is life out there, we shouldn't necessarily go looking for it because they'll probably destroy us or whatever it is. And I think that, that's not really a piece of it. The alien obviously is very scary in moments of this movie when, it abducts a small child and, there are scary things happening. But ultimately, at the end, it kind of winds up being this benevolent kind of strange force.
Misunderstood,
right.
Awkward.
Yeah,
yes.
Right. The childlike eyes, and then they smile and they do little hand motions, right? It ultimately winds up being, it's not trying to destroy the Earth. Whereas I feel now there's a little bit more of a fear, and I don't know if that's because the world right now feels very scary in general, and so of course everyone else must be, but I think it's a little bit different. But yeah, we're still, obsessed with aliens, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know if we fully qualified. MEDI is all about messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, which is highly contentious for some people. And you know, I thought it was interesting to sort of look at this film from the lens of, you know, if this film, because this film ended up being successful, if it sort of positively or negatively impacted people's views of aliens. And I feel like you almost can look at it through the lens positively or negatively, because you see them scaring people, you see them abducting people, but then it's like, but it's okay. And, you know, so I feel like it might be one of those movies where, like, depending on who you are and sort of like, you know, how you look at it, you can sort of see both sides. Do you feel like this movie made an influence on people of how they view aliens, positively or negatively?
I have to say, at the end of the movie, I was actually scared for Richard Dreyfuss and the other people going onto the ship. I'm like, I don't trust them yet.
What kinds of probing are you going to do?
They've been hoovering up people. They've just kind of delivered back a bunch of abductees. But while they're like, you know, contacting us and trying to do this swap, you know, they're still abducting people. And
you think they might ask the people that came off how it was before sending another person on?
And like, you know, the scene where they have that kind of religious ceremony for the people who are going onto the ship. I'm like, ooh, last rites, man.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I was still kind of scared at the end.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, was not alive when this movie came out, so it's hard for me to necessarily say, like, if it impacted things. I do think that it did very much play into this conversation of, like, the government covering up what they know, right? Because that's, like, a huge part of this. They're, like, you know, giving sleep gas to these animals to make it seem like there's this big toxic spill to cover up the fact that, like, this thing. And that is a thing that has been with us for a really long time, talking about aliens. Like, of course the government must know that this is happening, and they like, aren't telling us. And so I think maybe that, I don't think that this, like, quelled any of those fears or, like, those ideas, because it does sort of show how they might do that. I love the scene where they're, like, trying to figure out what to do, like, how to evacuate that area, where they're like, anthrax, no, we're gonna flood it, there's no water. And they're, like, all trying, and then the one guy, when he recommends anthrax, they're like, I love it. It was, like, so funny to me. They're like little plotting at their map and stuff. But yeah, I feel like that's the main thing that I would think maybe it had impacted, whereas people are like, yeah, the government probably does know stuff.
Yeah, well, and I mean, something that was really interesting about the making of this film, or how it came about, is that, you know, it's based off of this French researcher who's a ufologist and is trying to study people's experiences with alien encounters, and this is actually based off of a real person who's still alive today, Jacques Vallée.
Isn't he in the movie? He has, like, a cameo at the end?
He might.
He's, like, smoking a pipe at the very end, like the last scene when the aliens come.
I may have missed it. I should have looked for it. But yeah, so it's based off of, Jacques Vallée, and who has studied, you know, people's experiences with UFOs from the viewpoint of, you know, whether or not they actually had an encounter. There are interesting things to learn from it. Do you think there is a place for ufology in terms of, like, what we can learn, I guess, perhaps more about ourselves than aliens?
Yeah, you know what that reminded me of, you know, because I looked up his scale, and Close Encounters are kind of like in the middle of the scale, and the scale's kind of been broader now. But in linguistics, there's an area of linguistics where you study like narratives and stories that people tell. And sometimes they cohere in really interesting ways. Like there's common threads to the stories that people tell here in the Bay Area about if they've experienced the 1989 earthquake. And you can kind of line them up and say, oh, well, this kind of fits a category. And it seems like, I didn't read his original work, but it seems like he did this sort of discourse analysis of people's experiences of or you know how they're narrating this experience that they had, you know, real or psychological, and they kind of fit in these buckets, and he's kind of just kind of categorizing them according to his sort of template to it. But it felt very much like kind of a discourse analysis study, which is also kind of a psychological study.
That's so interesting, right? Because, like, in the movie, they all have that same vision of the Devil's Point, which is like a sacred place to many Native American tribes, and we probably shouldn't be like shooting movies at. But like they all have that same thing. It all is like kind of clumps together almost in the way that you're talking about. That's so interesting.
And they probably did have, according to the world of the movie, these shared experiences, because when they were interviewing Richard Dreyfuss and they said, did you get hives? Did you feel like your body heat up? Have you, like all of these kind of whole kind of array of symptoms? And you can imagine, and it's probably in these narratives that people are telling about their UFO abduction experiences that they say similar kinds of things.
Yeah,
so it's
and UFO culture is a whole thing, and it's been a thing that's sort of been predated the internet, certainly, and now, of course, on the internet, there are a lot of different cultures that are sort of around things that may or may not have happened. But yeah, I feel like UFO culture is this interesting thing to study.
Do you you probably get like letters from people who believe that this has happened to them, I would imagine.
I actually, I don't. I'm friends with people who do. I usually get emails asking if I can send stuff into space for people.
Okay.
People think I have like access to like a rocket launch like anytime I want.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask if you because if you write about certain topics, right, you end up getting mail from readers about those topics, right? And like I do wonder if folks can see those same patterns in just like the reader mail or like the viewer mail that they get about things like UFOs. Like I wonder if I don't cover this very often, so I don't get those. I get a different bucket of like odd letters from people. But yeah, I do wonder if there is like if you can find patterns within that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, so something you have covered though is been telepathy on your podcast.
Yes.
So you talk to experts about whether telepathy is really in the realm of science or possibility. Yeah. What did you learn about that? And what do you think does or doesn't apply to what was depicted in the film?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. I always love like learning the history of some of these things. And like telepathy is an idea that we've wanted to believe in for so long. And the word telepathy actually goes back to the early 1900s, this guy named Frederick Meyer. And it was kind of the time when like a lot of these scientists were grappling with the fact that like science was starting to explain things that they believed were divine, right? It's like, how do you both believe in science and also believe in God, right? Like Darwin had the same problem, right? These people are like trying to grapple with this. And so they jump through these sort of like logical hoops to like be like, oh, well, we can prove telepathy and therefore like we can talk to dead people, therefore there is an afterlife and therefore like everything's fine, Right, and so there were all of these experiments done, and actually like the field of telepathy was hugely instrumental in science. They basically developed the double-blind study. That's where it comes from. And very famous people, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Tesla, they all basically would write like as if it was like, oh yeah, in just a couple of years we're going to prove telepathy. Like it's a total, like the way that people today talk about like we'll have self-driving cars tomorrow or like whatever it is, like that's totally normal and natural. And
it's still alive and well in 1977 in this film.
Totally.
Because people are getting visions of what is it, Devil's
Point.
Devil's Point,
Yeah.
and they're sort of all of a sudden going like, I just have this thing in my brain that I have to make artwork around Devil's Point, and I have to,
Yeah, and like now today we don't call it telepathy, we call it brain-to-brain communication because that sounds fancier, which is actually exactly what they did. That's what Frederick Meyer invented the word telepathy, because like saying mind reading was too woo-woo, so he invented telepathy. They invented all these names for like things to make them sound scientific. So like they renamed haunted houses phantasmogenetic centers so that it would sound scientific. So now we call it brain-to-brain communication. And there is like real research on this, right? Like, and it's so funny because even in the early 1900s, they would say things like, well, they had discovered X-rays, they were discovering like, the telephone, like all of this invisible stuff was happening. And so they were like, well, why wouldn't the body emit some kind of signal that we can't see? But like, if you can take an X-ray and like look into your body, like why wouldn't you be able, like it sort of seems natural. And they would write things like, oh, well, the brain probably like generates electrical signals and then we could read them. And you're like, well, yes, it does, but like not the strength at which you would need. But so today they actually do the electrical signals they pick up in the brain, and there are all these interesting experiments where they try to kind of like connect to people via these brain connections and see if they can play a game together or see if they can direct something. And there's an experiment where they try to drive a car where they're like using their brain headset to like drive the car. And it's interesting from a linguistic perspective. They never it's never like words that they're trying to get people to picture or to like transmit. It's always either like images or just frequencies. Because words are actually like really hard and complicated to figure out how that works. Where like what they'll usually do is, or they'll like make people watch movie trailers for like hours and hours and hours and like look at their brain while they're doing it and then try to kind of reconstruct what they're watching. So there's just like lots of really interesting research out there because I think we do like, it's such an alluring idea that like you could, I mean, everyone's had that experience where you're just like trying to explain something and you can't. And if you could just like beam the picture over, it would just make everything so much easier. So it's super, like, it is really alluring. So there's still like a lot of research in this kind of world, not related to aliens giving us that, but we'll get there eventually.
Yeah. Well, and so that's how the aliens are communicating to us. But what we see in the movie that we try to do to communicate to the aliens is use music. Like I was really interested in your thoughts on like using music as a communication tool and like how much we can actually convey to another species, perhaps. Not that necessarily we even really know the answer to that question, but yeah, what do you think about using music as language, or at least how it's depicted in the film?
Yeah, I mean, we use music for a kind of communication ourselves. Humans do. Right? And it can communicate some things that we can't put into words. The idea of using it as like a kind of a structured language, I think, is a lot trickier. I think on this podcast you had Doug Vakach, right, on this, and he
from Medi.
I think, did he talk about the sonar Medi message?
I can't remember if he talked about the sonar one or not.
Yeah, that might have been. It was around the time that we were doing that.
I believe we had him on for Arrival to discuss the film Arrival. Yes.
Yeah. So so I mentioned it because that was a transmission that we sent out that was structured to introduce a bunch of music, and so there's a musical component to it. But the musical kind of tutorial part of it was kind of limited in terms of like if you wanted to have a full conversation. It was mostly trying to say, we're going to be sending music, and this is how kind of we're sending. We're introducing you to music by sending you like digitally encoded frequencies at like 100 hertz, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and then sending combinations of them. So like, prepare for combinations of, frequencies. And in this show, it was implied that there was a lot more going back and forth with the music. And even at the very end, so there's this like musical conversation that happens, and when kind of they have the person who's controlling the keyboard stop and like the computer takes over. That's when the conversation really gets heated up and like it's kind of flying, and the spaceship is really kind of flying with their music and back and forth. So you get the idea that a lot of information is being kind of transferred back and forth. But at that point, like, how much could they have really established? Because, like, if you're going to use it for language, you need to have established a whole bunch of different reference, right? Like, what are all the nouns? What are all the verbs? How do you connect all of those things? You would need kind of a means of doing that. And, that isn't elaborated. But at the very end, like, I think after all of the people walk onto the spaceship that are going to go up with them, and the Lacombe, Truffaut's character is out there and looking at the alien, and then Truffaut does the hand signals, right? Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly what they are, but he does, and I counted them, he does 7. And the alien that he's looking at does 5 back to him. And they're all the symbols that we've seen before. Yeah. They kind of map onto the Pentatonic Scale, the one that the main theme is. But there's clearly... like somehow the Lacombe character has sort of intuited meaning, and he's sending some kind of communication to this alien and getting like something in reply. So it's implied that there's more there. Mm-hmm. But whether it doesn't seem very natural for humans to be able to use a system like that. It would need to be mediated. Maybe if they get the whales involved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems like
that's the key.
It seems like marine mammals talking.
Yeah.
Like there's the implication that the researcher travels to India, gets music or sounds that are being used by people there to seemingly communicate with God. and then uses that as like sort of the chords to communicate with the aliens. And I guess maybe this is my reading into it, but the implication being, oh, all this time we were making all these chants and everything to God, but actually we've been talking to aliens unknowingly. And so of course they're going to understand these chords and these notes. I don't know, that maybe I'm like missing. It's a long movie, but that was sort of like one way of like looking at it.
Yeah, I thought that like, because I was also like, well, wait, like you don't have any kind of like Rosetta Stone type thing. So like, how are you talking to each other if you've never confirmed that you know what these things mean? Right. But my partner who I was watching with was like, oh, he had assumed that like, you know, when there's all of those shots of people looking at the spaceship and they all have that like look on their face, the same look that you see from Richard Dreyfuss's character, like when he kind of like gets that like, he's like doing the thing. He was sort of like, oh, well, the aliens are like telepathizing into your brain and like they're sort of giving you the information as the things are playing. Because you do see one moment where the keyboard guy, which I love that like they, instead of just like pre-recording the notes, they like have a whole keyboard and he's like playing the keyboard, which is amazing.
There's a great story behind him being there.
Oh, good. Okay, I want to get to that. But like there is a moment where he looks at the spaceship and you see that like the eyes that you see and like the little kid and like all that stuff. I had not thought of that, but this is what my partner said. And I was like, that like is kind of an explanation that would maybe work, but like I did not read that into the movie when I watched it.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Yeah, wait, tell me the story.
The background story. So first of all, that the keyboard that they used was like a new model by this company. I forget the name of the company, but the model is like ARP 2500 or something. And it wasn't commercially successful. They only made 100 of them. And one of them is in this movie. And it's an analog monophonic synthesizer, so you can only play one note at a time. So like at the end, I should have gone back and double checked this, but I'm pretty sure like when they're going, it's one note at a time, it's no chords. Right, but the guy that they sent, and it's like a huge panel, and they structured this whole arena around. It's like this big like music light show, right? So he's got this giant thing that he's controlling, and somebody's standing next to him going, you know, like up a fifth, down a third, you know, do semiquavers, and you know, so he's basically just kind of punching in these notes with these military people directing him. But that guy was sent. He worked for the company that made the synthesizer, and he was the one to deliver it to the set.
So he's not an actor.
Well,
I guess he is now.
He got co-opted to be the actor of the film. And I thought he was great, you know, and he has this moment of like wide-eyed wonder that you saw. But yeah, he was the tech.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Well, I mean, you talk about like the sort of government setup that they have. I wanted to ask, like, you know, in this scenario in Close Encounters, the government has full knowledge of everything, wants to keep the public completely out to the point that they're killing them and also gaslighting them and, you know, telling them, nothing's happening. But they don't seem freaked out, and they're just like, we got this. We're going to communicate to them. It's going to be awesome.
They just like walk underneath the spaceship as it flies, and I'm like, I just don't think they would do that.
It's just like a thing that's like bigger than Devil's Tower, right? Like dwarf Devil's Tower.
It's a government VIP party, you know, with aliens.
Everyone has the same aviator sunglasses.
You know,
they put them on at the same moment.
If we discovered something that was as close as we can get to definitive of extraterrestrial intelligence that was anywhere near Earth, what is your hope for how we would handle that? Like, you know, I guess in terms of like, you know, should the government lead the way? Should it be grassroots? Should it be nonprofits who are dead? I don't know. How would you wish we would handle it?
So one thing I was thinking about is that I think the scientists would be more involved. I think and international scientists, right? I think you would get lots of people listening, both amateurs and professional scientists, lots of confirmations around the world that they were actually getting communication. I mean, I'm not talking about like the mass telepathy of like blasting images into people's heads, but if you got like a radio signal, other people would be hearing it and trying to confirm it. So I think the scientists would know. I think the scientists would be interacting with the governments. This showed. I mean, there was Truffaut's character, who's French, but and then I think in the Gobi Desert when they find the ship. And the trucks that are driving in, I think those were UN flags on those trucks. So it seems like there's some sort of international cooperation, but you only ever see Truffaut as that like the only other person who isn't American, apparently. So you would think that there would be like and presumably people were being abducted from all over the world, right? So the the world has an interest in this, but it's only, Americans that are kind of running the show and kind of setting up the stage for this encounter, which I thought was a little odd. I don't imagine it would be the same way today. And I think probably the world would know about it because the scientists would know about it and would be talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the context of this movie in particular, like, it's hard to imagine. I mean, in 1977, which I think is the year this movie came out,
also the year that the Voyager missions launched.
Right,
So, yeah,
right.
we were
But also it was
thinking
like,
pretty...
the idea that, it's just, I loved that, like, there's that point that Truffaut's character makes where he's like, these are only the people who happen to see that thing on TV, right? That, like, they had this vision of this structure. They just happened to have the TV on at the time. Whereas now, like, there's the internet and, like, people can share things and, like, people would immediately find other people, right? These, like, there's also this idea that, like, these people have these visions and they can't connect to each other. They all think they're individually kind of like losing their minds. But like online, you can find all the other people who are losing their mind in the same way that you are very quickly. And like that is a thing that happens. And that is, and sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not good. But like, it feels like today it would just be so much harder. And unbelievable to me, as you say, that like how they would be able to keep it, that this would work as it did in the movie, but particularly now it just feels like completely impossible that they would be able to like keep all of these people in the dark and gaslight them, as you said, and be like, oh, this isn't happening, just because it's so much easier to like check things and like connect with each other and be like, well, if thousands of people have the same exact image in their mind, and not just the 3 charcoal drawings that he has, but like all of them, it's much harder to be like, no, nothing is happening.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think that gets me into my final question for both of you, because this film was interesting that it even took off, because I think Spielberg himself sort of viewed this as his weird art school sort of film, like a weird arty film. And you can tell it's very long and there's a lot of like human emotion in it. And you can tell, yeah, this is a weird art film. But it took off and it was massively successful and it became a mainstream film. And you mentioned the stuff from the internet and everything. So my final question for both of you is really, what would you like to see in a modern iteration of this film? Because we have had films like Arrival and everything that are more modern and have very different sort of vibe, but they still don't really incorporate the internet very much. If there was a modern film that was sort of mainstream, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, like what aspects or things would you like to see depicted?
But I really loved when they went and got the whole globe because they needed to figure a geographical coordinate. They had to roll it in. I think some of the old technology was just so much a part of the charm of this for me.
My favorite is the dog gas mask. When they were like the guys like selling the birds and the dog gas mask. Sorry, I just had to throw that in there.
Or when the mom picks up the phone, like the old kind of dumbbell phone, and she goes, yeah, so in a modern version, I would like to see them incorporate more of, like we were talking about the marine mammals. I mean, there are analogs on Earth where other species are using music very much for communication. There are people studying those and trying to understand them. Like bringing that into, like still focusing on the music. I love that. Like it's sort of like, John Williams did the score, and it's just like if he could do it again and incorporate all of these modern things into it, would just like if he could. I don't know. Has John Williams ever done anything with whales? That would be awesome. I would love to see that.
I read that he wrote like 300 versions of that like tonal thing, and before they like landed on the one that they went with. I would love to hear all 300 just to like know what they were like. Oh, not that one, not that one.
Why that one?
Yeah, I mean it's great, and they did a great job. I think that sort of similar to what you said earlier, like the international aspect, I feel like is something that's often missing from these movies. And I get that like as a narrative, it's hard to like talk about the whole globe, right? But like we have, it's not just the US that's looking for aliens, right? Like lots of countries have really powerful systems that are trying to look for this. Everyone's interested. Everyone has also like different cultural assumptions about what we should be sending and how we should send it and like what kind of music gets sent. And like all of this stuff is like all sort of mired in like who we are as like a people and who is sort of behind the program and all of this stuff. And I think, like something that really does get at that like this is a global search for like a, out in the universe, and that it's like the chances of it happening in the US are actually like not high, right? Like it might land in the middle of the ocean or like in another place. And like how do other people kind of like deal with that? And I mean, I actually loved Arrival. I thought it was really great. And I love the linguistic element of it, of like, right, like how do you actually try to do this? But yeah, I think like some of the like international relations around this, like what happens if, India does make a discovery like this? Like how do you like, who leads the charge and like and like there are some protocols that I'm sure you know about more than I do, but like, what does that look like in reality? And also like people are messy and like when they have something exciting like this, nobody really wants to follow like all the rules because it's like, you're so excited. So just seeing like how that would work and how like a non-white Western audience might like react to these aliens, because it's all like, especially in like US films, that's like all we ever see. So I'd love to see something a little bit more international.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you.
Yeah. Can you play it?
I
I
can
wanna
actually.
hear- Can you teach me the
I can
scale?
teach you.
Woo-hoo.
Yeah. Okay. So so I should say this is a keyboard calculator. And this,
What?
yes, and it was invented. Well, it came out on the market in like 1979, and I have to say I'm older than this. So this is old, but I'm older than this. But when it came out, it was just so cool, and it's featured in a bunch of popular music, like Devo, the Da 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 song. Use this. So I sort of know how to play it, but so I switched it on to its keyboard, not its calculator function, which is important. That's the first
crucial.
thing to know. So the pentatonic scale goes like this for C. And so the main theme just uses those notes a little differently. So
Okay. Wait.
Amazing.
So if you know a keyboard, this is your C, and that's D. So D, E, C, octave down, a fifth up.
Okay. I'm gonna just go by the numbers because I'm the worst musician in the entire world. Nope, this one. So it's. Nope, 2. Okay.
You failed communicating
5.
with
Okay, so
aliens.
This is the way I
I ruined it.
this is the way I teach my
Okay.
my nieces and nephews. Can I have your finger?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I gotta make it a little stiffer there.
Okay. Okay.
Amazing.
I communicated with aliens.
Very good.
Ariel, that was really fun. Something that, as I was listening to it, made me wonder, they never really explained why it's called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And that's because there is a leveling up. There is a close encounter of the first kind, or the second kind being a visual sighting of UFOs or some type of physical interaction, interference, radio interference. And of course, then the third kind is first contact.
Yes. So yeah, third base with aliens means actually getting to talk with them and interact with them. And the movie doesn't really explain it to my knowledge, but it explained a whole lot else. And it was really cool to talk with Rose and Laura about, just about all the different weird aspects of it and what they found interesting, and especially what they would like to see in a modern take on it. Maybe communication with whales, who knows?
I mean, sensibilities have changed in the 30 years. And as we were narrowing on this film, we even discussed the fact that the whole culture of ufology, of people thinking like they've had these shared experiences, or even identifying like a certain kind of stereotype for an alien, a lot of that is this feedback loop between science fiction and mainstream culture, and which then through this film gets turned back into science fiction, and it kind of influences everything that's come after it. I love that you mentioned Arrival and the allusions to things like Star Trek. Like it's all part of popular culture, and it started close to here.
Absolutely.
Well, we have more fun conversations like that on other episodes of Offworld. You can listen to the show as a podcast as well. Just go to tested.com/offworld or watch it as a video if you're doing that right now. And we'll see you at the next episode.